Welcome to the ASEAN Wonk podcast, where we bring you expert insights and regional perspectives on Southeast Asia and the Indo-Pacific, both on geopolitics and geoeconomics. I'm your host, Dr. Prashant Parmaswaran. If you haven't already, do subscribe to our ASEAN Wonk platform at www.aseanwonk.com so you don't miss all of our posts. Our guest today is Dr. Denis, who spent over a decade as the director of the research arm of APEC and also spent time before that in several other key economic institutions, including the Asian Development Bank. We will start our conversation talking about the state of trade. Be sure to tune in to the full episode. We'll be going through a range of other subjects, including Indo-Pacific geoeconomics, as well as what the regional and multilateral landscape will look like into 2026. So welcome to the podcast, Denis, and let's get started. I wanted to kick it off with where we are in terms of the regional economic architecture. You know, this is an architecture which, as you know, having been in several of these leading institutions, went through a series of waves. In the 90s, for example, we had APEC come to the fore, and there was, some excitement about institutional innovation and so on and so forth. It does seem like if we skip over a few decades now, there's a lot more conversation about minilaterals and sectoral deals and a lot of smaller groupings. But I'm wondering, how do you think about the role of regional economic multilateralism in terms of this geoeconomic environment that we're in? Obviously, we have these minilaterals, but at the same time, I mean, we still have ASEAN coming up with some digital initiatives that it's doing that's pretty region-wide. That's a multilateral institution. I also noticed that in APEC, there are still efforts to try to revive notions like the FTAP, sort of these bigger kind of regional sort of ideas around free trade agreements and so on and so forth. How do we assess this? And maybe is there a little bit too much doom on the multilateral economic architecture than is warranted? Is that a bit exaggerated, and maybe we should be a little bit more hopeful?
Well, thanks for having me. I'm a pessimist at heart, but I think I can maybe share a little bit of optimism about the economic and trade architecture. And as you mentioned, the last couple of decades, this region, I mean Southeast Asia, including East Asia, has been, we've seen closer economic and trade integration among these regions. And much of that has also been driven by the establishment of global supply chains, particularly in manufacturing, electronics, semiconductors, right? And of course, within ASEAN, it's been forging closer economic integration. It's got this big project, the ASEAN Economic Community, which was established in more than 20 years ago, and they're moving forward towards their next milestone post-2025. But we know the world's changed quite a bit, partly because of rising US-China tensions, and we're beginning to see that kind of fragmentation in the global economy. There's also a lot of disappointment at the multilateral trading system at the WTO. We know that a year ago there weren't many key major deliverables there, and the dispute settlement mechanism is still pretty stuck and not resolved. And a lot of the economic trade agreements have been kind of been protracted in trying to reach any conclusions. So in terms of the trend as you're moving forward, as you mentioned, minilateral, including economic kinds of minilaterals, a good example is DIPA, the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement. So you've got a couple of like-minded countries which want to move forward. They're stuck at WTO with e-commerce agreement, but we want to move forward in terms of the digital economy, digital trade. So one of the ways they do that is to come together and try to form kind of a partnership agreement among themselves. The other big trend, of course, is that moving away from the WTO is that we're seeing a proliferation of free trade agreements, both bilateral as well as regional. And of course, within this region, the big ones are like RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, which includes ASEAN and its 5 major trading partners, including China. And of course, beyond in the Asia-Pacific region, you've got CPTPP, right? The Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Agreement. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it's a reincarnation of TPP, as we know, and that excludes the US, but includes some of the big middle size economies. I guess the biggest challenge that we're facing here in terms of the economic architecture, particularly from the ASEAN perspective, is that ASEAN has always been known as for its strategic neutrality. It doesn't want to choose a side between US and China. We know that the US has a long presence in terms of foreign investments and technology transfers in this region. But we know that if you look at the supply chains that's been established, increasingly, or we see that a lot of those supply chains are linked to China. So essentially, ASEAN member countries don't want to choose a side. What they want to do is do business with both countries. And that's one of the biggest challenges that they face right now.
Got it. Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned DIPA and some of these other sectoral minilateral agreements, because it does seem like these agreements are proliferating. You know, you're seeing some in the digital space, you're seeing some on the green economy, for example. So that's a very interesting trend. I'm also wondering, one of the interesting conversations we're seeing as well is how do we think about updating some of these existing agreements that we have, right? So within APEC, for example, they've characterized this as kind of next generation trade and investment issues, right? So things like sustainability, inclusivity that, they were always there, but perhaps 20 or 30 years ago, they were not sort of as much front and center. And I noticed, APEC released a report middle of last year, and they mentioned that, there are all these kind of next generation issues that they were talking about. There's a whole list of them, but there hasn't really been an endorsement around, one or two or three of the areas of focus. And there's some of these next generation issues, but there are also these other issues that are a little bit more, I don't want to say contentious, but there are different views on them, like state-owned enterprises, for example. How do we tackle that given the different kinds of economies that we have? I'm wondering, how do you think about this basket of next generation issues, and where do you think, this basket of issues is going in terms of, if you were to highlight, one or two or three of them that you think might get more traction in the coming years? How do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, even within APEC and also ASEAN, they've been talking about a lot of these next generation trade and investment issues. We talk about from sustainability, impact of trade, from climate change, and also digital trade, right? The growing challenges that are being faced by the fact that the digital economy is growing faster than the regulators can decide. One of the biggest problems, I think, in APEC is that it's because its decision making is based on consensus, and also because of the geopolitics of tensions between the US and China. We can't get a lot of things done because if you put down on the table a major project looking at, say, I don't know, something on the green economy, for example, for different reasons, nothing to do with the project itself, it could just be blocked. So I think increasingly over the last couple of years, we're not seeing a lot of traction in terms of building capacity and working together. And that's one of the biggest challenges. Some of the big topics that they've talked a lot about in terms of next generation is, of course, sustainability is one. Increasingly, also the concerns of rising income inequality. And in the past, we had big meetings being canceled because of demonstrations and because of inequality, that there's been an increased focus looking at the formulation of much more inclusive policies, social inclusion, financial inclusion, of course, economic inclusion. So a lot of these things are being discussed. But the biggest challenge, of course, is how do you get that implemented? And within APEC, you've got 21 members, so it's getting a consensus of getting things done has become a lot harder. That's one of the reasons why you're seeing the rise of many of these minilaterals and different kinds of sector-specific partnership agreements, right? You're taking them out because they're stuck at WTO. They could be stuck in APEC or even ASEAN. And a couple of economies coming together and moving forward, whether it's in terms of trade liberalization or opening up your markets to get things moving. And I don't see that trend subsiding anytime soon. And that's one of the biggest concerns. It's a concern partly because, I'm a big supporter of the multilateral trade system, right? So the problem with a breakdown with the WTO is that, it's over 100 member economies, including LDCs, less developed countries, right? And it's the less developed countries will be the biggest losers because, it's harder for them to do a free trade agreement with another country because they don't have the kind of, what's in it for me, right, in terms of goods and services. So, again, one of the concerns is that we hope that the multilateral trade system continues to work, and that we might see hopefully some deliverables at the WTO this year.
Great, yeah, thanks. That's a very useful perspective, particularly on the countries that lose out when we don't have these multilateral approaches, right? It's the sort of lesser developed, developing countries, and I think that applies to fragmentation as well, right, in the global economic landscape. I wanted to ask a little bit about, there was this notion in the 2000s of, proliferation of free trade agreements and APEC and a number of other countries talking about what is the kind of grand vision here, right? And one of the things that I kind of mentioned a little bit earlier was this notion of the free trade area of the Asia Pacific, where you'd see, these trade agreements eventually coming together somehow in some macro perspective. One of the things that I'd be interested in your perspective on is, as we think smaller, these kind of minilateral groupings and sectoral areas, what does the grand vision actually look like? And perhaps maybe there isn't one, but how do we think about the connection between these sectoral and minilateral agreements and what the broader regional vision is for everyone that's trying to work towards some of these goals?
Well, I can only say in terms of more of economic partnerships and these when it comes to minilaterals, and a lot of them are WTO consistent. So the idea, grand plan, if you want to call it, is that they can get something done, they can get an agreement done, say in digital trade, right? And then if that expands, whether you have enlarged membership with more countries, right? DIPA is an example, right? Right now it's got Chile, New Zealand, Singapore. I think Korea is joining soon, and it's open for more membership. And eventually, whatever agreement that they make could be taken up back to the WTO, and you can restart negotiations, whether it's like e-commerce or other things. So in a way, it acts as a bit of a catalyst. Now, the Free Trade Asia for the Asia Pacific, or FTAP for short, is pretty much a grand plan, a really grand plan. I've seen that being discussed at APEC for years and years. Now, the thing about FTAP is that it's kind of a mega free trade agreement, and right at this time, I'm not too sure whether there's an appetite for yet another big regional free trade agreement. But the logic is there. I mean, from the economist's point of view, right? If you want to reduce trade diversion, that means that you're using a supplier who is less efficient or compared to a more efficient one. Then the more members you have in a free trade agreement, the better it is. So that's why you've got FTAP, or I guess RCEP is one of the big ones. Actually, it's the largest free trade agreement right now in the world. So you have these big free trade. You have less trade diversion, and you can facilitate an expansion of global supply chains or global value chains. So that's the general idea. So you've got these minilaterals working on one end, and you've got these big regional trade agreements, and hopefully there's some kind of convergence among them. And I think that's the general sense that they have. The biggest concern, of course, is you don't get conversions. You get this whole mixed up of different kinds of trade rules of origins. And in that sense, the biggest losers will be small companies. I mean, big companies, big multinationals, no sweat for them because they've got big legal departments that can sort out the different kinds of trade rules of origins, and work out which is best for them in terms of which bilateral or regional trade agreement. If you're a small, medium enterprise trying to expand your markets, that's a challenge because you don't have that kind of resources. So in that sense, it's up to governments to help them, I think, to kind of go through all the different kinds of free trade agreements, sectoral agreements out there, and see what's best for them. Which countries they want to expand to. Is it Asia? Is it Europe? Well, then you take this. Then I think you should sign up for this trade agreement rather than that one. So that's what's happening, I think, right now.
And the other question that's really interesting to my mind is this notion of the Indo-Pacific, right? And how does that fit in or not fit in with the geoeconomic picture. I think if you look at it geopolitically, there's a lot of appeal to this notion of the Indo-Pacific, right? I mean, it seems pretty natural. You've got a larger role for India, the sort of maritime connections between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, and so on and so forth. And you have this proliferation of kind of Indo-Pacific strategies. But if you look at the geoeconomic picture, it used to be that this was largely around the concept, as you mentioned, about the Asia Pacific, right? And APEC is kind of one manifestation of that, back in the 90s. I'm wondering how you think about this notion of the Indo-Pacific and how it applies to the geoeconomic sphere. I mean, we've obviously seen some initiatives, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework under the previous Biden administration. I guess the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific does try to connect the geopolitical and the geoeconomic. There's SDGs in there and so on and so forth. But I'm wondering where you think this notion of the Indo-Pacific is headed in the geoeconomic space, because sometimes I'm in conferences on geopolitics and then I switch over and I go to some of these other geoeconomic engagements, and it seems like, the Indo-Pacific is a lot more of a geopolitical connector than it is a geoeconomic connector. But I'm wondering how you see that pace of adoption on the Indo-Pacific and where you see that headed in the geoeconomic sense.
Well, it would have took off if, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPEF, really was concluded, because that would be a nice link up between IPEF and the more strategic elements of the Indo-Pacific strategy. We know that different countries have different sort of Indo-Pacific strategy. You talked about that too, and ASEAN has its own, right? The ASEAN outlook for the Indo-Pacific, which tries to find a way to, not pick a side again, right? So it's got a buy-in from the US, but it's got a buy-in from China too. China is a member of the AOIP. And that framework has a lot of potential, but right now it's not being implemented very well. It covers economic cooperation, maritime connectivity, supply chain connectivity. So on paper, it looks great, but you're right here that there's a bit of a disconnect. I think more worrying, it also, I think we know what happened in 2023. There are 4 pillars to IPEF, and the most important pillar, which is the trade pillar, didn't work out. And so right now you've got 3 out of 4 kind of working, and we're not too sure with President Trump whether he's going to continue with IPEF. We'll have to wait and see what happens there. But it's an important way for the US to continue to engage regionally with the Asia Pacific region. And that would have fit nicely with their own the more strategic geopolitical part of that strategy. So that's not there, right? So I think in that sense, I think that you will continue to have that disconnect until the US can make some major decision on whether they want to continue with the economic part of the Indo-Pacific strategy. And that leads to a bit of a vacuum, right? In a sense, that's where China comes in. Right, China is a member in Southeast Asia and East Asia of RCEP. That's a big free trade agreement that's already being implemented since 2022. It's got a kind of easy-to-use rules of origin that does facilitate regional content, global supply chains. So it's got a great potential here to strengthen the existing supply chains there. But you are going against this tide, right, of onshoring, nearshoring from the US, right? So that's the challenge there is that you've got a lot of pressure from the US to force multinationals and other companies to move more of their operations to the US or near the US, right? And at the same time, you've got very established global supply chains that are linked to China in Southeast Asia and East Asia. So, the worst case scenario is you are beginning to see a bit of that decoupling in terms of supply chains, where there might be new supply chains which are exclusively linked to China through RCEP, and that could be a scenario that you're happening. It's not ideal in my personal view.
Right, and you mentioned China, and as you said, there was a lot of attention on the sort of U.S. Tariff policy and trade policy side. But like you, I think I'm quite struck by China's posture in all of this. We are seeing Chinese officials publicize things like we've got a zero tariff policy, towards certain countries and certain regions. You're going to see China sort of host APEC in 2026. And of course, China's come up with some of its economic institutions of its own, right? The Belt and Road Initiative, for example, the AIIB, which, has actually taken off, since then, right? From when we saw sort of early U.S. opposition. So I'm wondering how you see China's inroads in this space. I mean, it seems like Beijing has a little bit of a mixed approach in terms of trying to engage minilaterally, multilaterally, coming up with a number of its own institutions. But talking to some Chinese interlocutors, I do sense that China senses that there is a sort of window of opportunity where, in spite of what the United States is doing, or perhaps because of what the United States is doing, there's an opportunity for China to actually position itself as being more proactive on trade and doing a little bit more geoeconomically and regionally, in spite of the fact that it's got limitations of its own. How do you see China's inroads in this space, and where do you think China's headed within this conversation in the next year or two?
I think you're right